Hi there, this is the Oak Bay Senior Debating Team. We've got 4 grade 11 students today who are going to be debating the media and its role in democracy. The format that we're going to be using is in 2 parts. The first part looking at our first affirmative speaker, speaking for 4 minutes, introducing the topic that the mass media is good for democracy. The students will be speaking for 4 minutes, introducing the primary topic, and then a 6-minute speech will follow, which will include rebuttal and their contentions, and then the initial speaker will have 2 minutes to rebut and to close the argument. I hope you enjoy yourselves. It should be an interesting debate.
Today we on Side Proposition strongly believe that this resolution before us, that democracy is good, that the mass media is good for democracy, should and it will pass. I'll be mainly presenting a political argument. The 3 main functions of the mass media in relation to our democratic institutions and to the development and implementation of policies of government. First, the mass media exposes democracy to critical examination. Second, it allows for a broader policy discussion. And third, it exposes corruption, inefficiencies, and ineffective government policies. First off, I'd like to go into my first argument, which is mass media exposes democratic institutions to critical examination. The mass media holds democratic institutions up to a light of scrutiny. It is able to ask those big questions about how democratic institutions are functioning and whether this is in line with our democratic principles, and if it's consistent with the idea of the public good. The mass media is able to ask the big questions about how democratic institutions are functioning and whether it is in line with with the public good and our democratic principles. The mass media is uniquely capable of this examination. An example of this was seen in Canada when the massive discussions at the Meech Lake and also Charlottetown Accords, in which the idea of the separation of powers of government and the impact of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was discussed, and how this was going to affect Canadian citizens. We saw that the mass media presented the arguments pro and also against, which allowed for individuals to understand what was the issues of these talks were being discussed. And this was shown with this amount of mass media and how it affected people's. When we saw in the election results of the Charlottetown Accords, we saw that 70% of Canadians voted. Way better than our federal elections will probably ever get for many years. The second reason why mass media is good for democracy is it allows for broader policy discussion. The mass media can create a national forum for debate in which a multiple of issues can be discussed, such as the wage gap, Indigenous relations, and also our foreign policies. An important way that the mass media can do this is through investigative reporting, shedding light on issues in Canada that may never be discussed. Consider the recent temporary foreign worker program that was brought to light not by government, not by organizations, but by the mass media. And it later showed about what the foreign workers was a role in Canada, whether it was good or bad for Canada. And thirdly, the mass media exposes corruption and inefficient governments. The mass media has investigative capacity and a reach into the Canadian public, and it can expose misconduct. One example of this was seen in the recent Mike Duffy scandal that resulted in a criminal trial. A second example was during the recent BC provincial government employee was destroying emails that were relating to the highway tiers in the transportation ministry. That was contrary to the provisions of the Freedom of Information legislation that we have in BC.
Thank you, Jacob McCauley, for your wise words. Our second speaker is Jonah Van Driesem. Jonah?
Thank you. From my opponent's speech, we see nothing that actually proves the mass media is good for our democracy. In our democracy, critical examination has become softball questions, and the mass media is focused purely on spin in politics, not substance. He talked about the Meek Lake Accord. The debate on that and the ensuing referendum was not a great debate of ideas. It was the same old political campaign with ads for and ads against, destroying character and dividing our country. We also saw this again in the constitutional crisis, where our government was faced with two options, and one was said to be completely illegal, and that was never disputed. Much of what we see in the media is only a twist of the truth. The Mike Duffy scandal was not brought forward by the independent media, but indeed by the Auditor General, who looked at the expenses and brought it forward to the public, who made the decision that this was wrong, that he was claiming these expenses. We also saw that the Foreign Workers Program was not brought forward by the CBC, which is under threat of constant cuts by our government, but this was brought forward by an individual who had been abused by the Foreign Workers Program. It is individuals who fight for our democracy, not the media, and a lot of the time, sadly, not our government. Instead of substantive debate on policy, we are still forced to view cynical ads meant to divide us. We use polls to justify policy instead of sound fact. We see this by having a push-through budget, push-through bills that have very little debate. And then we have our leaders' debates, where the consortium, who has the ability to reach the largest amount of viewers in Canada, be completely rejected by the government, who are the policy drivers at the moment in our country. Polls also drive down turnout. We look at the most recent British Columbia election. The NDP was projected to get a massive majority government because young people, who often vote NDP, turned out in record low numbers in that election. We had a fourth straight BC Liberal government, and the NDP actually ended up losing seats. We also barely passed the 50% turnout mark. The government also has the ability to use media access as a way of controlling the media. We look at interviews and such. The Prime Minister only allows for 3 questions to be asked of him. And let's say we have an election year here in Victoria, BC, and the Times columnist finds out that Mayor Helps did something maybe a little iffy, but nothing illegal, and they're going to run the story. But instead, Mayor Helps offers to give a debate on a big issue, and as long as the Times columnist kills the negative story. What do you think is going to be chosen? If we strengthen our public broadcasters, make politicians accountable, and educate people on the great policy issues going forward, we can truly have a media that informs our public and a government that works with them. Right now, we have a government that can manipulate what's being discussed so greatly that the public is suffering. This is starting our democracy to wither, and if we don't change something soon, the damage may be permanent. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that enlightened conversation. We have 2 more minutes for Jacob to close the argument. Jacob?
My opponent sees the media through a narrow lens. You okay, man?
Okay.
In which the entire media is in the pocket of government. This view is entirely out of touch of reality. He insists that papers will be forced to accept these supposed fluff pieces, such as a public transit. I truly believe that an editor will go for the biting pieces in our government. They're going to go for the biting pieces because what sells paper is not fluff pieces about public transit. It is about the biting pieces, but how our government functions and about how democracy is in Canada. My opponent also discussed that the CBC is the only true form of honest media in Canada. As if only one news organization can monopolize the truth in Canada. Canada's media is so diverse and vibrant, and news organizations with different views, progressive and conservative. And there's many examples across Canada, such as the Vancouver Observer or the Rebel Media. Canadian democracy needs a mass media. Thank you.